Namaste, hello, and welcome to the Matriarch Movement podcast. I'm your host, Shayla Olette Stonechild, and I'm here with someone that has inspired me throughout the last couple years. Her name's Chelsee, and she is the founder of Aaniin. For those of you who don't know Aaniin, I'm pretty sure it was the first retail store in Toronto that was Indigenous owned and operated, correct?
Yeah, it was the first for-profit Indigenous business.
First for-profit, okay. And where are you from?
So I grew up in Sarnia, Ontario. I'm a member of Aamjiwnaang First Nations. And yeah, I grew up in Sarnia my whole life, just 10 minutes away from my reserve. And yeah, that's basically small town. Like it's just very like farm fields. There's a huge chemical plant there. That's what we're pretty much known for, and bridge fries.
So you grew up on the res?
No, I grew up in Sarnia.
Sarnia. Okay, yeah. I was there actually once.
It's I saw that you were there like one time on your socials.
Yeah. It was actually a very inviting community. I was surprised.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's gotten a lot better now. When I was a kid, it was predominantly white and it was very difficult to fit in. But as the college has grown, there's been like a lot more diversity and representation in all ethnicities. So
yeah, that's what they were trying to create when I was there.
Yes.
Before we begin, also, I did want to offer you some tobacco just to open up the conversation in a good way. Thank you for being here. So getting back to Aaniin, it started in 2021?
Yes.
Okay. And I know I've heard from you personally that you were inspired by seeing something that you thought was like syllabics on someone's shirt in Toronto, but then it turned out to be like a triangle or just something else.
Yep.
And so could you talk a little bit about the inspiration behind Aaniin and where that came from?
Definitely. So yeah, it came from that exact moment. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. And by Wednesday, I had an entire dropshipping website up and running with 5 designs or 5 translations. The first one was Aaniin, of course. And then there was Gawin Giabi, which we still have today. And then there's 3 others that I forget now. But yeah, we sold out in the first week. We did $3,000 in sales. So I shut down the website right away because I knew that I was missing a very important marker. And that was how people were able to pass on the translation. Because our slogan is every conversation starts with Aaniin, and it's all about starting the conversation, but how does that actually happen? So we actually include QR codes at the bottom of all of our apparel so you can pass on the translation page.
And so the Aaniin came in like the syllabics that you originally thought that was.
Exactly.
Okay, so you created it through like a visualization that you had.
Yeah, as soon as I saw it, it's like, it just, one of those like aha moments where you've just seen it so you know it exists. So you just go out and you just get it done.
And for those who don't know what Aaniin means, could you define what Aaniin means?
Definitely. So Aaniin is how you say hello in Anishinaabe or Ojibwe.
Okay. And so now since it's been growing over the past couple of years, I know I had mentioned in the introduction that you were the first Indigenous owned and operated for-profit business here in Toronto. And I know recently that you actually closed your doors and stacked. And so first, could you tell me a little bit about the transition from first moving that initial drop shipping like online store to then having the vision to create an in-person store? Like what did that look like?
So I started with assembling my garments in my kitchen, and I basically was sewing the QR codes on myself. So I got like a bunch of patches ordered and I was just ironing them on. And I was like stitching them into the clothing and then putting these branded logos and QR codes on. So I was doing all of that from my apartment, and it was complete chaos. I was trying to sell it online, but I only had like 300 followers at the time. So I decided to use my sales experience. I worked in retail sales for over 10 years and I was a store manager for 7 of them. So I was like, I just need to get in front of people and I can sell. Like, I just need to get that done. And it was actually always a dream of mine to make something and go to a market. So I didn't even know that that was something that I could do. I always just saw farmers markets and like older people kind of like selling jams there and stuff. And I'm like, oh, that just looks like goals. So it was something that I really wanted to do myself. And I saw that there was a market at Stacked Market. After COVID, they were doing a comeback market. And we sold $4,000 in our first weekend. And that was like the first time I was like, people like this stuff. Like there was Indigenous people who like just stumbled upon it. And like those interactions were like so meaningful to me. One of our VIP best customers like still shops with us today. We've worked on like a lot of partnerships he's like a food caterer. So we've worked a lot with him. And then just like a few other people who are like still my friends today, just coming across it in downtown Toronto, being like, oh my God, is that native? And then they come up and talk and support. And yeah, so that's really like how I got into the whole stacked area. It was just like a one weekend market. I didn't know how it was going to go. And a few months later, I had basically decided to jump into the business full time. We had just come out with our best-selling line, our Tkaronto design, and we sold $15,000 when we launched that in April 2022. And I basically was like, okay, if we did $15,000, I need to quit my job. I need to start doing this full time. And if it doesn't work, I'll just go back to work and doing something else because I don't have a degree in anything. I don't have like a college diploma or anything. So I was just working in retail and different sales experiences. So I could really just go back to that at any time. So the risk wasn't really that prominent for me.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question is like, I think we're seeing kind of like the actualization of what you wanted to create, but I know those all have a story in a beginning. And so is getting into retail and creating design something that you've always wanted to do, or was that something you just kind of thought of?
Yeah. So the first day when I thought I saw the triangle on the street, I was actually already like trying to like create this vision in my head where I saw it in like retail stores, like in malls across Canada. And I was just like walking down the street babbling to my husband and he's like, you're insane. Like you just came up with this idea, and I hadn't started a business before. So it was really just like a fresh idea. It came out of nowhere. And yeah, just immediately I was just like, okay, it's gonna be in malls. It's gonna have like Indigenous youth working at it. It's gonna have all of these things happening. And yeah, it's crazy to see over the last 3 years, like all of these things actually happening.
Yeah. And I'm wondering like, why is it so important for you to see Indigenous like representation and the language even within the clothing that we wear and within just like mainstream society? Why is that so important to you?
I think the representation itself is obviously amazing, but I think just like in terms of like Indigenous people owning it and basically being able to walk outside with syllabics on their shirt and people actually take them seriously or think that it's cool and ask questions and have conversations. I think that was like really where it was coming from. Just because growing up in Sarnia, I didn't feel like I had a lot of those experiences. So it was kind of like a way to bridge the gap for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to kind of come together, while Indigenous people being like the main center of that conversation.
Right. So you're kind of like creating a bridge for people supporting one another, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous.
Yeah.
And I know when you're running a business, sometimes on social media, you see like the highlight reels and you see more of the success stories. And I'm wondering because you started with only $250, correct?
Yeah.
So like, what were some of the challenges that you've faced as an Indigenous entrepreneur starting a business basically from scratch?
Yeah. So I think the biggest one is still prominent, and it's access to capital. So that one there is like actually why we had to close our stores. So we were doing so well. We've done over $800,000 in sales since starting the business in June 2021. And about 95% of that has been since April 2022. So the real big stretch has been in like the last year and a half, especially, but we still don't have that capital support. So those are things that are really difficult to do. So when I first got started with the $250, I was bootstrapping and I still am. So that's kind of like a catch-22 is like, I'm always like so encouraging for Indigenous entrepreneurs to just start the business, even if they don't have any resources. But then it still catches up to you eventually. So you just have to kind of be like adaptable, and you just have to constantly pivot and just keep coming up with alternative solutions. Like if I just followed one plan, I would have stopped like my first week. But because I've had so many times that I've changed and just pivoted in terms of what is acceptable to me or what resources are available, I think that's what's allowed me to keep going. So it is possible, but it's just like a lot of work.
And for listeners that don't know what bootstrapping means, what does that mean?
So I actually just learned what that was like a few months ago.
Okay.
I was like, yeah, like I was bootstrapping it. And they're just like, no, you still are. And it's basically when you don't have investors, like you're still self-funding the business yourself. So for me, like even last week, I completely ran out of money. I needed to pay my staff, and I was transferring money from my personal credit card over to my business account. And it's like, I know the money's coming back. Like, I obviously wouldn't do that if we had no prospects. We're having money coming in, but it's just the money coming in is never as fast as it's going out. And that's the difficult position that a lot of Indigenous entrepreneurs are in. And it's kind of the essential, just like main practicality of what bootstrapping is just you don't have that advance to be able to inject money into your business so that you're sitting comfortably for a certain period of time before the money starts depleting or before you can start getting access to more funds.
And I know you and I probably both know the answers to these questions, but why do you think it is so difficult for Indigenous entrepreneurs and business to get access to that capital that a lot of non-Indigenous people have?
Yeah. So for me, I was actually, and this is like a very common story, but when I was 20 years old, I was $70,000 in debt. I dropped out of 3 college programs and I bought an expensive car because I was living at home and thought that I could afford it at the time. I just didn't have that grasp of what was tangible for what I was actually getting. I was like, I make $1,400 a month. I can afford a $600 car payment. I'm like, that makes sense. And it's things like that. Like when you're younger, it's true. Like you just don't know everything. And it's one of those things that you just kind of have to learn on your own sometimes, being put into that position. Because I actually paid off $70,000 of debt in 4 years. So by the time I was 24, I was debt free. And if I didn't make that decision, I wouldn't have been able to grow my business. Like right now, I currently wouldn't have a credit score where I'm able to get a personal credit card, which is a big issue that Indigenous entrepreneurs are facing. Because if you get into debt, then it basically takes like 7 years for that to fall off of your credit information. So that's been like a huge learning curve. And that's something that I really enjoy advocating for because I know how difficult it is. And at the time, I didn't even know that it was an issue. It was actually my husband who is very risk adverse. And he also has a lot of trauma with money, but it's like, he's a lot more scared of losing it as opposed to me. I feel like it's just like always incoming, always going. It doesn't matter. But it's really cool seeing his perspective because it put it into the larger perspective of what I actually was able to kind of like reflect on and realize, oh crap, I'm in a really bad situation. I'm only 20 years old and I expect to live a lot longer. So I should probably get my act together.
Yeah, it's funny when you're younger and like your perceptions are so different than like right now. But for some reason, when I was younger, for instance, like I thought debt was the worst thing ever. And so I did the same thing. Like I paid off everything on my credit card. I then was told I should start using my credit card for everything to get like points and to also get a good credit score. So I started doing that. And so now I have no debt. I have a great credit score.
That's awesome.
But I also lack mentorship when it comes to finances and when it comes to investing. And also when it comes to navigating, like you had mentioned, our trauma with money. And so that was going to be my next question is like, who has kind of been maybe one of your mentors or supporters to kind of guide you when it comes to finances? You mentioned your husband.
I think he's probably the biggest one just because we are polar opposites. So yeah, like growing up, my parents were always living paycheck to paycheck. And not because my dad didn't make enough money, it was because he didn't understand also like how to use his money too. So it was just living in Sarnia. There's so many things that you have to keep up with, like sports. And there was like, we were very fortunate to go into like soccer and basketball. And if my dad ever listens, he'll probably get so mad at me. But he took out like $100,000 line of credit to pay for all of those things.
Wow.
And like me and my sisters didn't know that until we were like 18 or 19 years old. We're like, why did you do that? And he's like, I wanted you guys to be happy. And I'm like, no, not to that extent. Like it's things like that. So I saw like my parents struggle with all of that. So I didn't really look at it that way until my husband was like, so how much debt do you have? And started asking me those questions. I was like, I don't know, like 30 grand. He's like, oh, and your car on top of that? And I'm like, or like, oh, your car included? And I was like, oh no, my car's on top of that. And he almost had like a panic attack. So I was like, what? Like, what is the big deal? And me being very solution oriented, I was like, it's okay, I can fix it. And I did. But still, it's like, I'm never going to put myself in that position again.
Yeah, that was going to be kind of like my next question too, is like, what kind of factors do you think about before saying yes to something? Is that something that's like on the list is like, how much debt would this create? Or like, what are the risks attached to this investment? Like, what does that look like to you?
I think it's like, I was still learning too when I got my store at Stacked. Like I just thought that if I had a store and if I was able to show people that we were able to sell real retail numbers, the money would come. And 2 years later, that's not true. So like, I just thought like, okay, if we can sell like 50 grand in a month, if we can sell 100 grand in a month, if we can do $800,000 in sales in a short period of time without spending excessive amounts of money on marketing and all of these different things that most businesses do, if I'm able to show the success organically, somebody will see me and give me money. And that's just like not the case. So I have like a very different perspective than I did when I first started the business. It was a lot of like trying to prove myself and say yes to everything. And it didn't matter what the financial outcome was because I got more customers or because I was able to meet new people who might be able to get me into different rooms and stuff like that. But now I've learned so much and I don't do anything unless it's profitable first or if like the financial outcome should be net positive at the end of the day. Whereas like a few years ago, I would have just been like, yeah, like I'll just do it. I don't care what's going to happen. I'll figure it out.
Yeah. And I think like there is some lessons that come through that because I was the same way where I would say yes to everything in my early 20s and I didn't get paid. Like half the time it was like volunteer work. Yep. But over the years, I realized like it did actually grow my network a lot so that now those people will hire me and actually pay me for 100%. Something. So even though I probably shouldn't have said yes to everything, I did find some teachings in that. But I think as you grow your business and as you grow yourself, like having the opportunity to say no and having the opportunity of choice is actually kind of a privilege because a lot of us don't even have a choice.
It's so powerful.
Yeah. And I think we're also still like, we're still in that survival state. A lot of us, like I'm privileged enough where I'm not, I can say no to money now if it's not in alignment with my values. And so coming back to value system, like what are your values when it comes to Aaniin? Because I know you're very focused on cultivating Indigenous representation and inclusion, but like what are the values of your business as a whole? And does that relate to who you are also personally as Chelsee?
Yeah, I mean, I think my earliest lesson of reciprocity was like my dad. Like he would get like a bonus from work and be like, look at my bonus. And like, it was really cute. And he would like share it with us. Like he would like give us money too. And we were like, what? Like, this is crazy. And then I talked to my husband. He's like, your dad gave you money after he got a bonus? Like, really? And it just wasn't something that like other families were doing. But I just kind of saw that like, if you got something, there should be other people benefiting it like from it too. So our values are community, connection, and collaboration. The biggest thing that I really try to focus on is who's profiting at the end of this. So my biggest advocacy point is like financial literacy and like financial empowerment, but through ownership, because there's so many different things that we can get recolonized out of our own businesses going forward. So those are just things that I'm really just trying to be very careful of for the future, because if you give up like 30% equity of your business right off the bat, then that's like less equity that you're going to have later down the line. And if it's to a non-Indigenous source, then your business is only 70% Indigenous owned. And then it's just going to get further and further diluted. If you ever go public, then it's completely not Indigenous owned, depending on how many shares you have. So those are just things that like, I'm kind of looking at these big like Tesla, Donald Trump, like I'm just like looking at all of the people that are just doing it already. And I don't like the things that they're doing, but I think there's a way that I can do those things, but for actual good purpose, and basically use the colonial system to actually be able to funnel out the money that we feel is like how we want to. But the way that I decide those exact decisions is through who's profiting off of it. So if I work with a partner and they're using it for marketing and they're selling a product, I'd say no immediately, because I don't want to sell other people's products. Like I want it to be on Aaniin. And if it's not Indigenous, I definitely don't want somebody selling other people's products that is with an Indigenous artist. It's okay to like do those things as like a solo artist. It's just, that's not the message that I want for my brand. So it's kind of things like that, is like, get paid, but it's just like, just be careful of who's profiting, because you really don't want to just like give up like your knowledge, your culture, your values, yourself, your time, your money, and you're not actually the one profiting at the end of it. Yeah. So whenever we're working with artists, like if it's Indigenous, I don't care who's profiting.
Yeah.
But when it's like selective to outside corporations or outside partners, I'm like, no.
Yeah. And those are often also difficult to, like, for example, I'm I exist in like a different way, I think, other than Aaniin. Like Aaniin is a business, but I feel like having worked with a bunch of brands and been on campaigns, oftentimes I'll hop on a call with a brand to see like where they are and what their values are and if this is long-term. And so what kind of conversations are you having with non-Indigenous people to kind of maybe not vouch for them, but like get an insight of if you want to work with them or not?
So typically I can tell right off the bat if they're basically trying, like, so say somebody's coming to us and they're trying to buy like a bunch of socks for merch. If they're like, oh, we want to change your logo to our logo. I'm like, no.
Okay.
I'm like, if you really want to support us, you'll keep our logo on it, but we can do like print marketing to be like, thank you so much, X company, for supporting our business. Like, it shouldn't matter at the end of the day if there's like a logo on it. We do some things like with our orange shirts, you can put the logo on the back, but you can't like design the shirt. You can't like change it in any way. It's like, we'll add the logo, but like we won't change, like we won't like make a shirt for a company just to have their logo on it. And that's like one of the biggest like things that people reach out to me for is I've had like the most random like contacts just like calling me because they see us on like the news or just reaching out being like, yeah, I work for this corporation. I really want you to do our merch. I'm like, why?
Okay.
How is that actually benefiting you? And then it just ends up like falling apart down the line because I just realized it's not actually worth my time and it's not worth my energy. We're not even profiting from it. So it's just like, those are just key things that just kind of appear as like the collaboration comes along. And then I just realized like, okay, that wasn't worth my time. I didn't end up doing it. And it's just something that I'm going to look forward to in the future of just like avoiding.
Okay. Yeah. So now I understand of like, you want to retain ownership of everything that you're creating. And you have mentioned time throughout this conversation. And for Indigenous entrepreneurs that are tuning in and maybe want to save some time and not learn all the lessons that me and you both have learned along the ways, what would your advice be for like the younger group of Indigenous entrepreneurs that are maybe wanting to start a business like from scratch?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is that there's going to be so much more opportunities. Like, we're all working towards these opportunities. There isn't going to be a shortage of them anytime soon. So you can be picky. Like, if you want, like, people, even for me, when I go into like financial institutions and they're like, well, you don't need to keep the company Indigenous owned. You just have to have 50% for it to be Indigenous owned. I'm like, no, like, just, I don't like that. And that's like the legal technicalities of like these specific topics and conversations. And I'm even told by some Indigenous people to do those things as well.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't feel right for me. So it's like, that's something that I've really held on to. And I think it's definitely been my kryptonite, but it's also been like the driver of like my messaging and our brand and like the deep roots of like what we're actually trying to accomplish. And I feel like we're still on that path to be able to accomplish that, like be a conglomerate one day and actually still be 100% Indigenous owned. That's like the biggest thing. So I think just Indigenous entrepreneurs, just be picky, keep to your guns, just stick to your values and just keep saying no until you feel like you've hit the right person to say yes to.
And I know, like, as an Indigenous entrepreneur myself, that sometimes when we're trying to represent our communities, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that to make sure everyone is wanting to feel seen and heard. And how do you ensure that Indigenous people are feeling represented and heard within your own brand itself?
Yeah. So oftentimes, like, I'll get like DMs being like, hey, we would love to work with you for this, but I'll just be honest, like right away. Like, sometimes people, I think they come to me and they think I have all this money. And I'm like, I am so broke right now. Like, let's talk about this in like a few months when I might have more money. Or if it's like a specific, like whenever I'm working with artists, I'm like, if you can get a grant, like if you can get an art grant, then we can definitely use that to buy product. So it's kind of things that, and I kind of learned these things when I was like a first time manager. If you want something, you have to show your value. It's like you have to show what you're able to bring to the table. So if you're like an artist and you're trying to work with like a company, go through to see how much it costs, what you're able to contribute, see what the actual financial outcome might be for both parties. And you might get more yeses than nos. It's just, if I counted the amount of people who wanted to just be a collab with us on like a weekly basis, it'd be insane amounts. But yeah, it's just, I just try to I'm just very transparent. I'm like, we don't have money. So, but a solution for that individual is if you get money, there's an opportunity right there.
And I think like sometimes for me, honestly, I'll think of the money as the last thing.
Yeah.
I'll think of like, how does this support the community? What is the storytelling aspect? What is the mission? What is the statement? What do you think makes a good brand, especially when it comes to like Indigenous brands and businesses? Because I know we operate with like a more of a reciprocal mindset. We're very relationship based.
Yeah.
So like, what do you think would make, a great like Indigenous brand or business?
I think just something that's versatile and can be adaptable with changes and times. Just because that's why we stick with like things that are so minimal, because minimalism is very in when we first started the business. I do see it starting to get like a little bit more like bold and things like that, but we're even just like adapting to that with like brighter colors. And like for me, I just like love the red. So it's just, those are kind of things that we're able to easily adapt to working with other brands. So if another brand is like, I don't know, we use like a lot of black and white and red. So if a brand is like blue and purple or something like that, like those are pretty easy colors to match. So I think it's just like, if your goal, like one of our values is collaboration. So I chose the colors because I wanted it to be versatile with other brands. So I think you just have to kind of look at your values and figure out what you think is like what it like. I don't look at like just like the design or the image when I'm looking at a brand. I think about like the purpose, and I think about all of the connectors that actually drive that purpose as well. So
I think for me, like a brand, like brands I really relate to, it's almost like I relate to the story or like also sometimes maybe the founder, but I know that can also get tricky because then you're following the founder's journey and then it gets very personal and then it's like,
a lot of drama sometimes too.
Right? A lot of drama. And then your image like is like attached to everything and you're like, very.
I used to be careful of like what I would say.
I was going to say, because I feel like your story is mentioned a little bit, but it's not like very...
No,
like you don't know a lot about you.
I don't really have a lot going on. Like I just like went to high school. It was just like, I just grew up, went to high school, almost failed high school. Like I hated school. I didn't have a good time with it. And then I moved to Ottawa and just started working, and I dropped out of like fashion school. I tried doing an optician program. But yeah, honestly, 95% of my life has been work.
But I think
so it's just like a long resume.
I mean, you have a great story though. Like I think with you have a very dedicated vision. You have really strong drive. You also know how to get back up again after failure, because a lot of people, even me, like if something fails, I'm like, I'm never doing that again. Like I'm throwing it in the trash. So I think like your ability, your resiliency throughout even the markets and like what's happening in the economy. So I think you have a strong story.
Thank you. I feel like my story is like began with failure. So now I don't care about it.
Right.
Yeah.
And speaking of like not caring about it, you spoke a little bit about how in 2021 is when you started and now you have closed the doors to Aaniin. Do you feel like the collective, we were talking about this with Aaniin yesterday, of like feeling like sometimes indigeneity feels like a trend. Yeah. So do you see that also within your business of when people are supporting and buying your product versus not? Yeah, definitely. So even like around Christmas time this year, it was like very different to last Christmas. Like we still did really well. We did like, I like to speak with numbers because then it's not as like off-putting and scary to other entrepreneurs, but we did like $110,000 at Christmas time this year from Black Friday to Christmas. And we basically, like, I had like a lot of people coming into square one, and it was just like the average person. And I'd have some people kind of walk by the store and give looks, but like people would mostly just like run towards the store because they saw that it was like a new store that opened. And then I think they would get the sense that it was like a very cool store, which it was. And they would get to like the front and see that it was like Indigenous, or they would come in and just start to see like kind of what it actually was. And they would just kind of like back out. And it was like very off. Like it was very like emotionally draining for me. So I'm kind of glad that the stores are closed, because it was such like a task to just kind of like uplift myself every single day, all day, when like I don't always have the energy to do that. So I don't want to have a store until we basically have like a full-time store manager who
their job is to basically like make sure the store is staffed, like make sure everybody's trained, like all of these things, like deal with the customers and like the issues and stuff. Cause I have such like an emotional connection to the business that it's hard being the founder, the store like clerk, and also just like doing everything behind the scenes. It's like, I think I cried like 3 times, like hysterically during that pop-up, and like 3 times like in front of strangers too. Like they would just say something and I would be like, fuck.
Well, and during those moments where you are feeling like overwhelmed and maybe burnt out, like what are the rituals and the routines that connect you to like your spirit again?
I think it's just kind of like, I usually just have to like push through it. But then there's like definitely like a period, because I was there for 5 weeks and I was there for like every single day by myself because I couldn't afford to like have my staff there. We were doing another pop-up that was free. And if I knew what I knew after the pop-ups were done, it definitely wasn't worth the time to have my staff being paid to go to the free pop-up. We should have just not done the free pop-up and just paid them to be at our paid pop-up, because there was nothing happening at the other place, but I was like drowning myself like at the store by myself. But I purposely put myself there because I knew I could handle like the traffic and the high volumes of sales, but I definitely needed like that support. So I think it's just kind of like, I'm good at like compartmentalizing, but then after I know that I need to like release it. And that's just kind of like my whole cycle of, I guess, my chaos is like, I put myself through the ringer, and then I don't do anything for like a week or 2. And then I just get back to it.
Yeah. It's funny. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts lately, and all of them are talking about having the ability to control your emotions.
100%.
And I'm like, but do you even feel like, I guess for me,
100%.
but okay. So you kind of like control it until you have space to navigate your emotions.
Yeah.
Okay. And given like where we're headed as, you know, society, I think we're now headed towards this timeline of artificial intelligence and all online. And for me, I'm wondering if like in person, like in department stores are even going to be like that much of a thing. Like, I feel like everyone's online shopping, TikTok shop. Like, so do you want to like increase your online store? Is that something that you're doing? Or what does that look like for you? So
we do have like the e-com, like our goal is to basically do $1 million in sales. I always say it out loud too, because if you just keep saying it, it'll happen. So our goal is like to basically do $1 million online and then start to slowly come back to brick and mortar. But we're always getting like new opportunities. Like the Eaton Center reached out to us after they saw the Square One pop up, and they're like, hey, we do have a lease for you, and stuff like that. So, but it's like a 1-year lease. I don't want to sign on for something that long. So there's just kind of things like that. But I think the biggest thing is like with brick and mortar, typical traditional brick and mortar where it's like very marketing, vinyl stickers all over the windows, big sales, that is dying. But the customer experience, like when I was working in retail, I was always the top salesperson, because if somebody picked up a pair of glasses, I would literally be like, oh, that's from our new collection. And I would like talk to them about, like, I would read all of like the info cards that like the brands would send us. So I had to learn about like Ralph Lauren, like all of these different brands. And each season we would get like a new collection in the cards to kind of like talk about the inspiration behind the collection. And I think I was the only person who actually read them. But anytime somebody would touch them, I would immediately start storytelling. And that's how I was able to make sales, regardless of if it was like an $800 frame or like a $200 frame. So I made people kind of like feel connected to all of the brands that I was speaking to. So I definitely have seen that it still works. It's just, it needs to be done in a different way. And I'm happy that I started my own business, because I think I can bring it to light and true fruition of like what that actually looks like with like the QR codes, the translations. Our store, it was literally a bunch of stories, because it was individual artists, it was individual like cultural designs where they're basically working with like their community, or it's just something that's like special to them in their culture. So it was just literally an abundance of unlimited storytelling. And I think that we can unlock that with whenever we do start to get our department store. But I've definitely taken a different perspective of how I think that's going to happen. And since this topic is Indigenous futurism, basically the goal is to kind of just buy like a building in downtown Toronto and actually leverage that to actually be able to run our business and have an asset to kind of get lines of credit and do the big things that we want. Like for me, my apartment overlooks all of the downtown skyscrapers. And since I started my thoughts about Aaniin, I'm like, I want to have a skyscraper in downtown Toronto. So I think I see that coming more and more. But yeah, there's just like 1,000 different things that I want to do. And it's just kind of like picking up whatever one's first available.
Right.
Yeah.
That is a good image though. It's kind of like getting land back, but getting like
Exactly.
property back. And now that you mentioned it, I think shopping in store, you do have that relational aspect.
Yeah.
And that's something that you can't just...
Yeah, you can't brand from like a lot of other
online
businesses.
And so also thinking of like land back, it makes me think of like reconciliation. And we've heard this term a lot now. A term that I'm hearing more of is economic reconciliation.
Yeah.
How can non-Indigenous brands and people support reconciliation if they are wanting to support, for say, like Aaniin?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing, like financial institutions, I think they can just like, there's different ways that you can access money, and like it happens all the time, but it's just not in like that like systemic sense. It's like if somebody kind of knows somebody and stuff like that. So it's like they could easily start making policies that like banks or financial institutions that require lower credit scores, or not even a credit score. It's just only based off of business performance. And there's so many different things that they could be flexible with, but they just aren't. So I think just like creating like new systems and new policies, like even for me, I've gone into like banks before and they're like, I'll meet like the head of their Indigenous business banking program. And they'll be like, yeah, like we have like these amazing offers. And then I'll basically go to the bank and I'll be like, do you have an Indigenous banking program? And they're like, I don't know. And it's like that type of like miscommunication. So I think it's just like they need to like do the work within the systems before they actually start coming out to like get us to advocate with them. Because it's like, there's so many times that I've definitely slipped through the cracks, or I see other people slipping through the cracks. And it's like, you really have to advocate for yourself constantly. And I think it's just like, maybe help us like stop having to talk so loud or like so much. I think that's the biggest thing.
And the educational, like having to educate for free and emotional labor all the time. For the listeners, how can they support Aaniin? What are you up to for the rest of the year? How can we find you? And support everything that you're up to.
Yeah, so we're having a lot of fun on socials right now.
I've seen.
We're just constantly like filming TikToks and Instagram Reels with our team and other Indigenous influencers. So basically we're trying to still drive that community type of like involvement. We're focusing a lot more on socials just because we don't know what next year is going to look like, but we know that we still want to have storytelling involved. Like even if we don't have the financial means to keep providing all the merch that we've been doing, like all of like the different collections and clothing like styles and stuff like that. But we do want to have like an impact, like with media, like with all of these different outlets. So Aaniin might not always look like a clothing brand or a retailer. It's just all about starting the conversation. So it might just be accessible in different ways. But if you see us start a podcast, listen in. If you see us on socials, be sure to like and share. And we're still going to have like the retail platform on our website. So you'll still always be able to sell or to buy other Indigenous brands from our website. It's just our stuff might take a little bit of a backseat for a little bit. So don't miss out and buy those collections if you see it.
And maybe you'll see like a Matriarch Movement times Aaniin collab in the future, or like some in-person event.
Yep, definitely.
So right after you, we actually have Jacqueline Jennings on the show, and she's an impact investor that's worked with Raven Capitals and Lululemon and Microsoft. Do you have any questions for Jacqueline herself?
Yes. First, I want to say hi, Jacqueline. So aside from impact investing, what do impact investors look for aside from the actual impact?
Well, thanks so much, Chelsee, for joining us on the show. I've learned so much around Indigenous business, entrepreneurship, and I'm sure I'll continue to learn from you and your team. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.